Agradecemos a todas las personas presentes en este auditorio, así como las jornadas, y vamos a dar inicio a la ponencia del doctor Martí. Primeramente voy a dar una breve semblanza del doctor. Es doctor por la Universidad de Chicago y ha trabajado principalmente en lo que es la filosofía moderna temprana, con énfasis en los racionalistas. Asimismo, ha trabajado el puente entre la metafísica y el racionalismo, con varias publicaciones como Being and Reason and Interpretation of the Spinoza Metaphysic, Rationalism and Utilitarianism, News, Teleology and Human Action in Spinoza, and the Philosophical Review and Spinoza's Argument for the Existence of God. Sin más, le agradecemos su presencia y comenzamos.
Hello. So my topic today is Spinoza's pluralism. So Spinoza is, of course, a monist. He believes that there's just one substance, one world. He calls this substance God or nature. And he also thinks, though, that this one substance, this one world, can be conceived of in infinitely many ways, two of which are known to us. Those are thought and extension. Extension being the principal attribute of what we would now call the physical world, and thought, of course, being the principal attribute of mental reality. So somehow or other, this one world, this one substance, can be conceived of in infinitely many ways. And what of, Spinoza thinks there's just one substance. So what of all the particular objects that populate our world that we are acquainted with in ordinary experience, like shoes and ships and cabbages and kings? Those are, of course, for Spinoza, modes of the one substance. And just as the substance can be conceived of in infinitely many ways, each of the modes that adhere in and are conceived through this substance, so too can be conceived of in infinitely many ways. And Spinoza says that it's the very same mode that appears under the attribute of thought as a mind and appears under the attribute of thought as a body. Those two modes are identical, and indeed are identical to modes as conceived of under infinitely many other attributes as well. Now, so part of my paper is going to be about how to understand these attributes. What is it to say that we can conceive of one substance in infinitely many ways, and to explore an alternative interpretation that sort of resists this way of characterizing the attributes as ways of conceiving the same thing. But we'll come to that in a minute. So one difficulty that stands in the way of understanding this metaphysical picture that I've just sketched out in the broadest of outlines is that in addition to claiming that modes conceived under diverse attributes are in fact one and the same, in other words, your mind and your body, for example, are the very same thing conceived of differently, he says that he appears to say that there is no mind-body causation. Minds don't cause bodies to move. Bodies don't cause minds to think. Now, this is, somewhat standard in post-Cartesian rationalist metaphysics, but it's a very strange doctrine to hold if you simultaneously claim, as Spinoza does, that mind and body are identical. If minds cause bodies to move, if minds cause minds to think, and Spinoza does believe that there is genuine causation between modes, he's not an occasionalist like some post-Cartesians. So if minds cause minds to think, and bodies cause bodies to move, and minds and bodies are identical, then it would appear to follow by the uncontroversial logical principle, the indiscernibility of identicals, that bodies cause minds to think, and minds cause bodies to move. Now, That's just because nothing can differ from itself. And if minds are causing bodies, minds and bodies are identical to minds, then bodies are causing minds. On pain of contradiction. So, the alternative interpretation of the attributes that I want to explore in this paper and then evaluate against the more traditional conceptualist interpretation of the attributes, the one, in fact, that I favor. The alternative solution I want to explore has been proposed by Don Garrett, according to whom attributes are not ways of conceiving a substance. Rather, they are distinct manners or ways of existing. So, one substance exists in multiple ways. A substance is a thinking substance insofar as it enjoys the kind of existence proper to mental things, and it's a thinking substance, it's an extended substance insofar as it exists in the ways proper to extended or physical things. Now, we'll get to this in more detail later, but just a preview, Garrett thinks that this, in conjunction with Spinoza's highly epistemic and psychological conception of truth, allows Spinoza to avoid contradiction with respect to mind-body causation by rejecting the identity of indiscernibles. Not the identity of indiscernibles. I'll probably do that a lot during this paper. That's the famous Leibnizian doctrine that any two qualitatively perfectly similar things are identical. The doctrine I'm interested in is the converse of that, which is that nothing is dissimilar from itself. Now, the Leibnizian doctrine is interesting, fun, controversial. The doctrine I'm interested in, the indiscernibility of identicals, is boring, obvious, uninteresting. It's that things are different from themselves. Garrett thinks that Spinoza is committed to rejecting this principle, and for good reasons, which we'll get to in a bit. So just to say something about ontological pluralism in general, to sort of motivate the view and maybe make it a bit more intuitive to you if it isn't already. It's, philosophers who are ontological pluralists come in various stripes, and they're pluralists with respect to various kinds of existent things or kinds of beings. So, for example, you might think that numbers and notebooks both exist, but they don't exist in the same way. When I say that numbers exist and when I say that notebooks exist, I'm saying something quite different in the two cases. Notebooks exist perhaps concretely, whereas numbers exist abstractly. And we're not ascribing the same existence to them. Those are different, distinct, fundamentally different manners of existence. This view is attractive to some philosophers. Many throughout the history of philosophy have gone for something like this with respect to the past and the present, the possible and the actual, substances and modes. It's pretty widespread among Aristotelians, the kinds of people who say things like being is said in many ways. Those are ontological pluralists. My undergraduate students seem to be ontological pluralists very frequently. So when Garrett says that the attributes are diverse ways in which the substance exists, he is advancing a version of that somewhat commonplace notion that being is said in many ways, and one way it's said is as thinking existence, and another way that it's said is as extended existence. That has its roots in Descartes. We're all familiar, I suppose, with Descartes and the Meditations, making a distinction between formal and objective reality. Some things exist both objectively and formally. The sun has objective being or reality insofar as it exists in the mind, whereas it also exists in the sky, but it doesn't exist in the same way in the mind and in the sky. In the sky, it has formal reality. In your mind, it has objective reality. So Garrett's idea is that Spinoza's attributes are like that. Things, modes of the attribute of thought have the kind of what Descartes calls objective reality. They are like the sun as it exists in the mind. And modes of extension have formal reality. They are like the sun as it exists in the sky. Now, there are differences between Spinoza's ontological pluralism and Descartes', obviously. Spinoza thinks that everything has both formal and objective reality. Everything without exception, whereas Descartes thinks that only some things have both formal and objective reality. Those are things that exist outside the mind and also people think about. So diamonds buried deep beneath the surface of the earth that no human being has ever thought about, those have formal reality but no objective reality. The hallucinations of a drunk, a pink elephant, that has objective reality but no formal reality. Spinoza, on the other hand, thinks that formal and objective reality belongs to each and everything. Now, he also thinks that there are many other different unknown forms of reality, infinitely many more than thought and extension. That's on Garrett's interpretation of Spinoza. It's important to understand that on this ontological, pluralistic reading of Spinoza, being is not a genus. There is no attribute-neutral notion of existence, of which objective and formal reality are restricted notions. Rather, the basic fundamental notions are thinking reality and extended reality, and any kind of attribute-neutral notion of existence that we possess is formed derivatively from those more fundamental, more basic modes or ways of existing. I'll try to avoid saying modes of existing because of the well-known confusion that term engenders in Spinoza. So the basic ways, manners of existing, the concepts of those can be disjunctively brought together to give us a generic or attribute-neutral notion of existence, but our understanding of that derivative and disjunctive concept is through our grasp of one or more of the more basic, fundamental manners of existing, or the concepts thereof. Now, any attribute-neutral notion, according to Garrett, is similarly derivative and disjunctive. We might have a notion of power that is not specific to an attribute. How do we have such a concept? Well, we start with our notions of thinking power and extended power and so on through the other infinitely many but unknown attributes, and we connect them via disjunction. So in other words, it's either thinking power or extended power or unknown attribute power and so on through the list. Our grasp of that concept is via one of the disjuncts, one or more. Same goes for cause, essence, substance, mode, adherence, and so on. Anytime you have an attribute-neutral concept, it is derivative and disjunctive. Okay, so that is, in a nutshell, very briefly, Garrett's conception of ontological pluralism as it gives us an interpretation of the attributes in Spinoza. Now, that alone is not going to motivate any rejection of the indiscernibility of identicals. In order to get to that, which, to remind you, we need in order to avoid this paradox about mental causation, Garrett turns to Spinoza's theory of truth. Spinoza has a very distinctive and original conception of truth. We see it most clearly spelled out in the treatise on the inundation of the intellect. And here is a quote from that work. Spinoza writes, "As for what constitutes the form of the true, it's certain that a true thought is distinguished from a false one, not only by an extrinsic, but chiefly by an intrinsic denomination. If someone says, for example, that Peter exists, and nevertheless does not know that Peter exists, that thought in respect to him is false, or, if you prefer, is not true, even though Peter really exists. Nor is this statement, Peter exists, true, except in respect to him who knows certainly that Peter exists." So, to summarize, so a subject S, their belief that P is true if and only if P agrees with its object. It's definition 6 of the ethics, looking ahead. S knows that P, and this is my gloss of the intrinsic denominations that are said to be more important than the extrinsic ones in the text from the treatise on the inundation of the intellect. S understands why P. And that's because the intrinsic denominations, I presume, are something like clarity and distinctness, the intrinsic features that all and only true ideas have. And Spinoza thinks that clarity and distinctness are produced by the mechanisms which generate understanding. So in order to have a true belief, you have to not only have a belief that accurately represents the world, but you also have to have epistemic warrant for it. You have to know that it accurately represents the world, and you have to understand why this is the case. So Spinoza is packing into his theory of truth not just a notion of the world being as it's represented, but also these cognitive, psychological, and epistemic notions as well. This now forms together with ontological pluralism a platform for rejecting the indiscernibility of identicals. So, because if we start with inherence as an attribute-neutral concept, right, recall that it is derivatively disjunctive. It is it's mentally inherent, or physically inherent, or blah 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 inherent, predication is entailed by inherence. Predication being the operation whereby we generate a truth from an object. So attribute-neutral concepts must be understood through a specific attribute. However, there's no one attribute through which we could understand mental causation of the physical, or physical causation of the mental. We can't say anything that spans two attributes because there's no appropriate concept of predication that could apply to both modes of existence. For this reason, we can reject the identity of insertables, and now we apply this to the problem of mind-body causation. And although mind and body are identical, and minds cause minds to think, and bodies cause bodies to move, we cannot apply the principle of the indiscernibility of identicals and infer the conclusion that minds cause bodies to move and bodies cause minds to think, because that would be to employ a rejected and discredited pseudological principle, the indiscernibility of identicals. We can't understand mind-body causal claims, and so they can't be true for us. Well, or just untrue on Garrett's reading of Spinoza's theory of truth. All right, so that's Garrett's pluralism and his solution to the problem of mind-body causation. Now I want to turn our attention to the old-fashioned, tried and true conceptual pluralism that I am an unreconstructed believer in. I'll briefly walk through the details about how I understand that view, and then we'll be in a position to compare which of these interpretations better fits the text and makes better sense of Spinoza. So, as I presented Spinoza's metaphysical views at the beginning of this talk, I was already cooking the books, stacking the deck. I described the one substance as conceivable under the attribute of thought, conceived under the attribute of extension. The thinking substance and the extended substance are one and the same substance, but because we think of them in different ways, a distinction of reason obtains between them. There's no real distinction. They're the same substantially, but there is a mere distinction of reason. And this is what Spinoza himself says in the appendix to his geometrical exposition of Descartes' Principles of Philosophy, the Cogitata Metaphysica. Spinoza writes that God's attributes are distinguished only by reason. All the distinctions we make between the attributes of God are only distinctions of reason. The attributes are not really distinguished from one another. Understand such distinctions of reason as I have just mentioned, which are recognized from the fact that such a substance cannot exist without that attribute. Now, that's from an early work. Does Spinoza still think that the distinction between attributes is merely a distinction of reason by the time he writes his mature masterpiece, The Ethics? He doesn't invoke the phrase distinctions of reason, but I think it helps us make sense of the definition of the attributes in definition 4, where he writes that by an attribute I understand what an intellect perceives of a substance as constituting its essence. Here we have, it's an odd definition by any measure, but one of the most striking things about it is the pride of place given to intellectual perception. Why are attributes defined in terms of how the intellect perceives the essence of a substance? Now, there's been a long-standing controversy about the proper interpretation of this. I won't bore you with all the ins and outs of that debate. I will merely comment that if Spinoza's definitions are meant to be real definitions, in other words, to be statements of the essence of the things that he's defining, then intellectual perception is somehow essential to the attributes. Now, of course, I said I wouldn't go into the ins and outs, but I can't resist. For a long time, people thought perhaps the intellect projects the attributes. They, somehow introduces distortions or distinctions into a substance which in itself admits of no such thing. But as years ago, Villoro pointed out, the intellect always perceives truly according to Spinoza, so whatever it is the intellect is perceiving there must have must be true and not a distortion, not an illusion. But I think that if a distinction is grounded on intellectual perception, that ought to raise at least the likelihood that the distinctions between the attributes are distinctions of reason. Now, Spinoza uses the term distinction of reason in the Cogitata Metaphysica, but he doesn't say all that much about how we ought to understand such distinctions. It is more of a label than a worked out theory. And perhaps he's presuming on the part of his readers familiarity with the long tradition of theorizing about distinctions of reason that Spinoza would have known from his early philosophical education and were commonplace in the philosophy handbooks of scholastic philosophy in the 17th century context. So it's natural to look to those sources to gain some insight into what Spinoza might have meant by distinction of reason. So one such representative of this tradition is Franco Bergersdijk, who was a very prominent 17th century Dutch scholastic, who wrote influential handbooks on philosophy, several volumes of which Spinoza owned, and or at least were included in the inventory of his library. So I think this is a good place to look to see what Spinoza might have been presuming that his readers would have known about distinctions of reason. Burgers did, like many scholastics, distinguish between two different kinds of distinctions of reason. There is distinctions of reasoned reason and distinctions of reasoning reason. Many people are familiar with this distinction from Suarez. I think Burgers' Dyke is much more interesting than Suarez on the distinction of reason. I hope you'll agree with me. So here's what Burgers' Dyke says about the distinction of reasoned reason. He says, this is quoting from Burgers' Dyke's Instituto Metaphysicorum, the distinction of reasoned reason also arises from the mind, from multiple concepts, each of which is appropriate to one and the same thing, but unequal to each other, and thus dissimilar among themselves. The cause of this inequality and dissimilarity in multiple concepts of the same entity is in the entity itself, namely diversity in quantitative reason or in reason as the logos of the thing. Hence, one thing is apprehended by unequal and dissimilar concepts. So in other words, if something has an essence that requires the use of what Burgers' Dyke calls dissimilar concepts, in other words, concepts with different meanings, they're semantically distinct from one another, they are genuinely different concepts. In order to describe the essence of something, you might need to use more than one concept. However, that essence is not necessarily, made up of parts that are separable from one another. It's not, so the essence is not made up of really distinct parts. They might be necessarily co-instantiated essential properties, but in order to accurately describe it, we have to use multiple concepts. So the thing is one in itself. It's many in concept, but the reason why we have to use multiple concepts derives somehow from the nature of the thing itself. It can't be captured by a single concept. That's sort of Burgers' Dyke trying to split the difference between finding a way in which a distinction of reason can somehow have a foundation in the thing itself. Now, I don't think that this is going to be a very promising way of interpreting what Spinoza means by a distinction of reason, because I don't think we can make sense of mode identity on this conception. If the essence of a substance has to be conceptualized by different concepts, and the model that I'm using, it's not mandated by the text, but this is the best sense I can make of it, is that they are necessarily co-instantiated essential properties. That's why they're not distinct. They're not really distinct because they're necessarily connected, but they demand multiple concepts. I can't make any sense of the notion that modes of different essential properties can be identical to one another. That to me is like saying that a certain shade of red is identical to a certain shade of blue. If these are distinct properties, their modes can't overlap, or it would be like saying a certain degree of charge is identical to a certain amount of mass. I just don't know, when do modes of different properties ever, or when are they ever identical to one another? That would be a bizarre way the world was organized, if it were. It certainly wouldn't be something that Spinoza would think was sort of obvious from the fact that there's a distinction of reason between the attributes. More promising then is Burgers' Dyke's characterization of the distinction of reasoning reason. Here's, I'm just quoting from Burgers' Dyke from the same text, different chapter, same book. The distinction of reasoning reason arises when one and the same thing is apprehended by multiple concepts, each of which is appropriate to it and similar to the others. Thus, synonyms are distinguished, like ensis and gladius, mulier and phomino. This distinction is so slight that it does not prevent a proposition from being identical if it consists of a subject and predicate that differ only in this distinction. It entirely depends on the operation of the mind without any real diversity or cause of diversity in things. So here, there's a distinction of reasoning reason if we cognize an object by means of multiple synonymous concepts. And Burgerstein illustrates this notion by reference to synonymous words. Presumably, he thinks of these synonymous words as analogs for synonymous concepts. He's thinking of concepts like mental words, and so just as Latin has synonymous words like gladius and ensis, so too might the mental language have concepts that are synonymous. Now, this can be, the distinction of reasoning reason might seem trivial, but consider the following two sentences. I guess I went to a different example because English lacks perfect synonyms for woman and sword. It has a great one for cougar. I'm not sure if this works in Spanish, but we'll see. So take the sentence: a cougar is a cougar, and a cougar is a catamount. A cougar is a catamount; those are synonyms. There's no difference in the truth conditions of those two statements. However, despite this, there is a difference in cognitive significance. The first statement is obviously true, and its truth can be determined merely by inspection of the sentence. No further research is needed. I don't need to go into the mountains and hunt down any cats. Merely by inspecting the sentence itself, I am certain that it's true. The second sentence is not like that. I might not know that a cougar and a catamount are synonyms. And it might also be the case that the only description that I associate with both words is maybe a kind of big cat. That's, if you think about my concepts of various species of trees, most of them are like that. I don't know what the shape of their leaves are, or the texture of their bark, but I do, in some sense, confidently use the word elm and oak tree and birch. Well, I might not know anything about cougars and catamounts, although I possess the concept and don't associate different descriptions with them. So how do we account for the difference in cognitive significance of these two statements? Well, the only real difference, there's no semantic difference. The only real difference is either orthographic or phonological. Just the way the word sounds or the way it looks on the page. That can create a difference in the way we think. Now, similar concepts in Burgerstein's characterization of the distinction of reasoning reason, that is to say, when multiple but similar concepts are used to describe a thing, they must be distinguished not by their semantic features, but by their intrinsic features. I rather speculatively put phenomenology up there. That's pure speculation. You don't need to take that seriously if you don't like it. But given that Spinoza thinks that ideas have formal reality, they do have intrinsic non-representational features that can serve to individuate them with respect to their different cognitive roles, even if they represent the very same thing in the very same, with no descriptive or referential difference. So, a distinction of reasoning reason then occurs when we use synonymous concepts that have some kind of intrinsic difference between them, or perhaps a difference in inferential role. So now let's see if we can apply Bürgersteig's conception of a distinction of reasoning reason to the definition of an attribute in definition 4, part 1 of the ethics, to see if that is in any way, shape, or form illuminating. As we just discussed, the definition is by attribute I understand what an intellect perceives of a substance as constituting its essence. So on my interpretation, the attribute is the essence of a substance. But because that essence is cognized by the intellect or perceived by the intellect in multiple similar ways, a distinction of reason is created. Now, we can think of the different ways that we think about the essence of a substance. We can think of them as different conceptual languages or different conceptual schemes. According to Spinoza, there are no inferential connections between these various conceptual schemes. Each attribute, he tells us in Proposition 10 of Part 1, is conceived through itself. That is to say, there are no, my interpretation is there are no inferential connections between the concepts associated with the attribute, say, of thought, with, for example, the concepts associated with the attribute of extension. Moreover, the conceptual schemes or languages associated with each attribute are expressively complete. You can tell the whole history of the world and not leave out a single detail using only the conceptual resources associated with the attribute of thought. You can tell the very same story using only the conceptual resources associated with the attribute of extension. It's rather like how you can tell the whole history of the world in Spanish or English. Without any, maybe loss of poetry, but no loss of meaning. So loss in terms of the orthographic or phonological features, but not in terms of what is said. I know from hard experience that at this point I have to issue a warning. It is not my view that the attributes are conceptual schemes. They are the essence of the substance. But because we perceive, or the intellect perceives that essence by means of these various conceptual schemes, a distinction of reason is created. There's really only one essence, but if we count by real distinctions, there's one essence. But if we count by rational distinctions, there's infinitely many. All right. Now you have these two interpretations in front of you, the ontological and the conceptual. Let's see if we can figure out some tests that can help us decide which one we like better. Let's look at some texts. So, one text which is indeed strongly suggestive of Garrett's ontological pluralism comes from the corollary to Proposition 7 of Part 2, where Spinoza writes, "Whatever follows formally from God's infinite nature follows objectively in God from his idea in the same order and with the same connection." So here you have the vocabulary of formal and objective reality, which is a close relative of the kind of ontological pluralism that Garrett attributes to Spinoza. But it's at best indirect evidence because you have to have more than formal and objective reality to get ontological pluralism as an interpretation of the attributes. There may well be ontological pluralism in Spinoza, but is that ontological pluralism the explanation of why there are infinitely many attributes? But I concede that this is decent evidence in favor of the ontological pluralist's view. More tendentious, although I've often had this proposition cited against me, but I think it rather favors me, is Proposition 9 in which Spinoza writes, the more reality or being each thing has, the more attributes belong to it. Well, the ontological pluralist says, see, he's claiming that attributes are being in reality. The reason why an absolutely real thing has infinitely many attributes is because attributes are ways of being. So we're just stacking ways of being on top of each other, stacking reality on reality. But I prefer to read that as meaning that if something is absolutely infinite, then it produces every possible way of thinking. And since distinctions between the attributes are generated by different ways of thinking, well, obviously an infinite substance is going to generate infinitely many ways of thinking about itself. So now this also makes sense of Spinoza's correspondence with Tschirnhaus, about which we heard a fair amount yesterday in Yitzhak's paper. I'm not going to go into the dialectic so much, but Tschirnhaus says if each mode is identical to a mode in every attribute, then why can we think of only two? Here's one thing Spinoza says in response. Now, he says, each thing is expressed in infinite ways in the infinite intellect of God. I'm not going to try to explain why this should be a response to Tschirnhaus. I just would like to note that here Spinoza seems to be associating the infinity of attributes with the intellect of God, the infinite intellect of God, and the intellectual power associated with it. Another piece of evidence comes from letter 9, in which Spinoza's friend Simon de Vries writes to him and he says, how can one substance have more than one attribute? This is nonsense. If you have more than one attribute, I would think you have more than one substance. And this is what Spinoza's response to Tschirnhaus. He says, you want me to explain by an example how one and the same thing can be designated by two names, though this is not necessary at all. Now that, of course, is not what de Vries asked him for. He asked him how one substance can have more than one attribute. Spinoza immediately changes the subject or recasts it as how can one thing have more than one name? Not to seem miserly, I offer two. I say that by Israel. I understand the third patriarch. I understand the same by Jacob, the name which was given to him because he had seized his brother's heel. By flat, I mean what reflects all rays of light without any change. I understand the same by white, except that it's called white in relation to a man looking at the flat surface. So, does that letter suggest ontological pluralism or conceptual pluralism? Well, Spinoza thinks the issue is at least analogous to the issue of multiple names for a single individual. Names, like singular concepts, are not devices for expressing different manners of existence, but rather devices for referring to individuals. So that doesn't at least suggest ontological pluralism. And then the second example that Spinoza provides, which I think is much better for his purposes, flatness and whiteness, I read that as they're the same property presented to the intellect in two different ways. One in an experiential format, another in a non-experiential format. If Spinoza wanted to say that there were different manners of existence, this would be a perfect opportunity for him to say flatness is the same thing existing formally as whiteness is existing objectively, but he does not. All right. Now, which interpretation better handles the problem that I started with, which is the problem of mind-body causation? So here is a representative text which has often been taken to mean that Spinoza has a very strict, unyielding, exceptionalist ban on mind-body causation. It says, the modes of each attribute of God for their cause only insofar as he is considered under the attribute of which they are modes, and not insofar as he's considered under any other attribute. Now, one proposition later, in the scholium to that proposition, Spinoza asserts mode identity. This seems to be very paradoxical in the context of proposition 6. This is not lost on Spinoza, who immediately after he asserts mode identity, he goes back to clean up the mess that he had left. And he said, when I said God is the cause of the idea, say of a circle, only insofar as he's a thinking thing, in other words, an application of proposition 6, that was for no other reason than because the formal being of the idea of the circle can be perceived only through another mode of thinking as its proximate cause, and that mode again through another, and so on to infinity. Hence, so long as things are considered as modes of thinking, we must explain the order of the whole of nature, or the connection of causes, through the attribute of thought alone. So, I take this to mean that he is correcting any misapprehension you might have had about proposition 6 by emphasizing this is about perception, conception, and explanation. Those are all cognitive and or epistemic notions, not metaphysical relations like causation. His topic is causal explanation, not causation as such. It is cognitive and epistemic. This is important also because he uses the identity of the modes to offer a new argument for the parallelism. The official demonstration of proposition 7 is widely viewed as defective, but it's okay, all is not lost. There's a better argument. Spinoza says, for example, a circle existing in nature and the idea of the existing circle, which is also in God, are one and the same thing, which is explained through different attributes. Therefore, whether we conceive nature under the attribute of extension, or under the attribute of thought, or under any other attribute, we shall find one and the same order, or one and the same connection of causes. That is, that the same things follow from one another. Here is how I reconstruct his thinking here. A physical circle and the idea of a circle are really one and the same thing, but there is a conceptual distinction between them as a result of the different concepts we use to think about it. Therefore, by the indiscernibility of identicals, the physical circle has causal rule R, if and only if the idea of the circle has causal rule R. So I don't think we can reject the identity of the indiscernibility of identicals. If that's not standing behind Spinoza's argument in 1P7 scholium, I don't know what is. And so I think we're much better off with an interpretation that preserves the logic of that scholium. And that logic requires the indiscernibility of identicals. Now, taking a step back for a second, both the ontological pluralist and the conceptual pluralist attribute to Spinoza a great deal of redundancy. The ontological pluralist thinks that there are redundant manners of existence. This is because, unlike the case of notebooks and numbers, where different things are said to exist in different ways, the Platonist can calm you down a bit when he says numbers exist. He says, oh, but not in the way the notebooks do, don't worry. It's a different manner of existing. But Spinoza, on this interpretation, is saying everything exists in exactly the same infinite ways. So there's no distinction being made. It's just, in fact, every property exists in every attribute, in every manner of existence. So the same thing is just showing up again and again and again in different manners of existence. The conceptual pluralist is not much better off. The same story is being told in different conceptual languages over and over and over again ad infinitum, right? So we're on par with respect to this profligacy. But I think the conceptual interpretation helps us would shed light on Spinoza's effort to solve the problem that he thought was real, which is, if monism is true, why are there so many dualists? Why is dualism the default position in his own philosophical context? If he is going to argue for monism, he owes us an explanation for the plausibility of dualism. And he says, this is the explanation. We have too many concepts. We have concepts that are bear no inferential connections to each other, and they deceive us. They mislead us into thinking that there's more than one thing. And that leads us into theorizing about mind and body and how they're causally isolated from one another, and so on and so forth. I don't see any similar kind of utility that the ontological pluralist can provide, and there's no philosophical interest that Spinoza himself has that ontological pluralism speaks to. And so, for that reason, I think that given the textual evidence and the way that conceptual pluralism sheds light on the topic of genuine philosophical interest of Spinoza's, I think that I'm going to stick with conceptual pluralism, at least for now. Thank you.
Ahora, en este momento, pasaríamos a una sesión de preguntas. Sería la pregunta, se la voy a traducir al Dr. Lim y traduciría la respuesta.
Gracias. Dr. Lim, thank you very much for your exposition. Mi inquietud es la siguiente, estimado Erwin. Usted ha explicado muy bien y de manera muy clara esta idea de Spinoza de que hay una sustancia y luego múltiples modos y atributos. Mi inquietud es la siguiente. ¿Hay algún lugar de la obra de Spinoza en el que él se entretenga en explicar por qué hay una única sustancia? Quiero decir que concentra su atención en que cuando dice que hay una sustancia, en la sustancia, pero no en la unidad. Mi inquietud es si hay algún lugar de la obra de Spinoza en donde explique por qué una única sustancia. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Well, that topic is explicitly addressed in Proposition 14, but here let me summarize briefly for you Spinoza's reasoning.
Se explica en la proposición 14 y va a explicar el razonamiento detrás de eso.
So first he begins by showing that every possible substance necessarily exists.
Comienza diciendo que todas las sustancias posibles necesariamente existen.
And then he applies this to the case of God, who he defines as an absolutely infinite substance.
Y se lo aplica a la idea de Dios que define como una sustancia infinita.
And so he gives 4 different arguments for the existence of God. My favorite one is that there's no power capable of preventing his existence.
Da 4 argumentos para la existencia de Dios. El favorito del Dr. Lim es aquel que dice que
there's no possible power capable of preventing his existence.
Que no hay ninguna potencia que sea capaz de prevenir la existencia de Dios.
And it's because God is absolutely infinite, once God necessarily exists, there's just no room for anybody else.
Y dado que Dios es la existencia de Dios es absolutamente necesaria, no queda espacio para que haya cualquier otra cosa. Dios tiene adentro.
And so there's just one substance.
Por lo tanto, solo hay una sustancia.
Thank you, Marty. I'm delighted that you are exploring and developing the reasoning interpretation. I mean, obviously, on every position of this view, we have some important or serious problems, but I see at least two significant problems with the path that you are charting. So that would you mind going to the Opus 5 passage of the reason?
Yes, I would not mind.
¿Va a hacer un comentario acerca del apartado sobre la razón razonante?
So here's the problems are very simple. So when you look at the end of the paragraph, without any real diversity or cause of diversity, things infinite, right? Now, what happens if there is one thing, and I conceive it as 2 or 5 or 7 or infinite? On the face of it, it seems that I'm making an error. 1 is not 2 and not 5 and not infinite. And so if the intellect is perceiving what is 1 as infinite, we're in trouble. So that's one problem. The other thing is, look at the definition of God. God is supposed to consist of the attributes. Right? Assuming the attributes are a substance consisting of an infinity of attributes. Right? Assuming the attributes, as you suggest, are conceptions, then God himself consists of infinite conception. What consists of infinite conception must be a conception itself. So that turns out to be another idea, nothing but an idea. Right? Insofar as conception is an idea. And as a result, I mean, the entire, either you're becoming an idealist and then we have the whole social problems, or you're undermining the barrier between the attributes. So these are the two questions.
No need for an intervention. I'm not becoming an idealist. With respect to your second question, I'd like to refer you back to my warning. Attributes are non-conceptual schemes, neither are they concepts or ideas. They are the essence of the one substance. Any attribute is the essence. They are all the same essence, presented to the intellect differently.
But you were saying that several times you refer to them as conceptions and conceptual.
I refer you to this slide. Attributes are not conceptual schemes. The attributes are the essence. There is only one real essence. They are rationally distinct insofar as the intellect perceives that essence by means of distinct conceptual schemes. And let me refer.
What are the distinct things which are? They are not the essence because the essence is one. So when you have a distinction, what are the things which are distinct that you look for?
Anytime you have a distinction of reason, you are counting the same thing twice. You know, that is what a distinction of reason is. That is the point of the tradition is to explain how things can appear to us distinct, even in contexts where that appearance doesn't make things irrational or misguided, but can create misunderstandings. So, for example, this is traditionally applied to the question of the divine attributes. God's justice, God's mercy are one and the same thing, but they're conceptually distinct. So this is, once again, the distinction of reason comes to the rescue to explain how not justice and mercy are really one but two in concept, but how thought and extension are really one but two in concept. That is just the job that the distinction of reason was invented to play.
You're saying two in concept, I mean, it's two concepts, no?
Sure, there are two concepts, but the concepts aren't the attributes.
So what's the difference between the concepts and the attributes?
The concepts are the attributes are the essence. The essence is what satisfies the concept. And so, I mean, look, justice and mercy are distinct concepts, but they apply to the same essence. I mean, that's really only a slogan. But I take it that the Cougar Catamount case, look, there's no mistake when I say a cougar is a catamount, right? I've made no error, I've uttered no falsehood. That is absolutely true. In fact, it is a necessary truth. A cougar, sorry, I was just randomly going through slides. A cougar is a catamount. That's true. I've made no error. I've attributed no multiplicity to the species of cougars. But the fact that I have two words that have the same meaning, and let's analogize that to two mental words, two concepts, can create misunderstandings, and that's what happens to a fellow like Descartes, who falls into the falsehood of dualism because he mistook two concepts for two things.
Voy a hacer un breve reseña de lo que se acaba de discutir. Básicamente, la cuestión era sobre si la multiplicidad de atributos y conceptos daba como resultado una multiplicidad también de los seres, si se terminaba en eso. La respuesta del Dr. Lin es que no, simplemente los atributos son formas distintas de pensar la misma esencia y por lo tanto se mantiene una misma sustancia y así no se cae en el error de Descartes de darle a cada atributo su propia esencia y por lo tanto multiplicar las sustancias. Básicamente eso fue la discusión.
Irving, I apologize for making your job more difficult than it needs to be.
It's totally okay. Hola, buenas tardes, profesor Lin. Muchas gracias. Digo en inglés. Bueno, la cuestión es la siguiente. Me interesa mucho la forma en la que define los atributos, pero encuentro difícil estar plenamente de acuerdo con la idea, sobre todo al final con la conclusión del pluralismo conceptual como la forma adecuada de entender los atributos. Al igual que usted, comparto la postura de que los atributos constituyen la esencia de la sustancia, pero creo que al mismo tiempo esto nos debe dar una clave para entenderlo en el sentido de la proporción 34 de la primera parte, es decir, como potencia, como expresiones de la potencia infinita de la sustancia, y de ahí entonces los atributos son resultado, son reales, pues, son lo que la mente puede percibir, y precisamente porque puede percibirlos, los puede conceptualizar. Y en ese sentido, la respuesta un tanto a la cuestión que trabajaban tanto el profesor Melán como usted, se encuentra en la explicación de la definición 3 de la segunda parte, en la que se distingue el concepto de percepción, y en ese sentido el concepto de atributo va más hacia percepción que hacia concepto. Precisamente el hecho de que esta distinción se encuentra ahí nos da como la evidencia textual de que la lectura de que el pluralismo conceptual es la forma quizá privilegiada para entender el atributo, puede estar, digamos, en cierto problema, ¿no? Porque precisamente hay una distinción clave entre concepto y percepción.
So, if I understood the question correctly, and thank you for your question, once again, yes, there is a distinction between concept and attribute.
Si se entendió bien la pregunta, ¿hay una distinción entre atributo y concepto?
¿Podemos clarificar? It's perception and concept.
Perception.
Perception and concept are two different terms defined in the explanation of the definition 3 of ethics 2.
And what do you suppose the difference to be?
Is the difference between perception and concept is follows.
I'm going to translate directly from Spanish to English. So a concept, more than a perception, is the name, because the name perception indicates what the mind suffers or is affected by in virtue of its object. But concept expresses the action of the mind. As in this sense, attribute is something perceived, as is insofar as the mind is passive and also able to understand the nature or the essence of the substance, and concept is what the mind forms in regard to this perception.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. That's something that Spinoza says in the definition of idea, and it's given a very important place in the work. But do you think that the perception referred to in definition 4 is meant to express something essentially passive?
Lo que
I was asking if you thought that perception in definition 4 was carefully chosen by Spinoza to express some kind of passivity of the intellect.
La pregunta es si cree que la elección de la palabra de Spinoza de percepción implica cierta pasividad.
Indeed, as it is insofar, it is in Ethics 1, and it is the effort Spinoza is making is try to be able to form a concept of what is perceivable of the substance as such, and that speaks more of the power of the substance than of the power of the mode.
Okay, so I'll just say a couple of things that indicates, perhaps where we diverge. I don't think the intellect can be passive for Spinoza.
Está afirmando que el intelecto no sería, o no cree que sería pasivo para Spinoza.
And also I think there are many texts in which Spinoza uses conceives and perceives interchangeably. So I think that although you do point to a text where he makes a distinction, just as you quote him doing, he doesn't always respect that distinction in his own writing. And so I'm a little bit hesitant to make much of that definition of idea for part 2 and import it into to definition 4 of part 1. But I'm willing to, my ears are open if you want to convince me.
La idea sería que Spinoza utiliza los términos de manera intercambiable en varias ocasiones, por lo tanto no le daría demasiado peso a esas distinciones o esos usos distintos de los términos y pues está abierto a continuar la discusión.
Well, it's not that I have to convince you as such as it is in regards to what I see, that one has to be able to calibrate the relevance of the usage of the concept within the framework of the theory. And insofar as Spinoza is using the term perception, perceptio, not idea, but perception, and not idea again, but conceptum.
Perdón, sería aquí cuestión de calibrar el uso de los diferentes conceptos que usa Spinoza
de acuerdo con las partes en las que se encuentra el texto, ¿no? And insofar as that is the case, Ethics 2 is where one can find the concepts of concepts and all that is related to the epistemology of Spinoza. So perhaps you're able to find texts that work conception and perception that are interchangeable, but I don't think that it is easy to disregard the clarification Spinoza himself makes at the opening parts of Ethics 2.
Well, I don't disregard them, but I also take very seriously his claim, at least as I read him, that the intellect cannot be passive.
Se preguntó que no sería tal vez tan afortunado el desechar las distinciones que hace Spinoza o los usos de distintos conceptos que hace Spinoza, y la respuesta es que no es que se deseche, sino que se atiende a la afirmación spinoziana de que el intelecto no es pasivo.
Okay, I understand that. However, the concept of concept and the concept of perception are there for a reason, and I think the reason is that the intellect, insofar as it cannot be absolutely passive in relation with the substance, it cannot be actually totally active because it also perceives, i.e., is affected by the different ways in which the substance expresses its power. And I think that that is not a creative or purely affirmative dimension of the substance, but it also involves the limitations that are inherent in human nature. And that is something that Spinoza himself.
Well, you know, I guess I would ask you, why then is intellectual perception essential to the attributes? If they're merely passively registering what's already there, why drag intellectual perception into the definition? It seems it's kind of like a superfluous redundancy.
Sería, la pregunta sería si por qué se trae esa distinción, se considera o la considera superflua, la distinción entre
why should intellectual perception be essential to the attributes if they're merely registering what's there and they play no kind of significant role in the essence of the attributes?
Si la percepción intelectual no juega un rol en la esencia de los atributos, porque se estaría trayendo a la discusión que más bien pareciera una distinción superflua.
It could be superfluous because the intellectual perception enables us to understand nature as such, and the attributes are, so to say, the key for the legibility or the understandability of nature and of substance. So, in that regard, intellectual perception is key in order to understand, i.e., be affected, not purely to affect substance.
En ese sentido, se responde que no serían superfluos, la distinción no sería superflua, porque son esenciales para la percepción intelectual, para comprender la sustancia.
So it seems to me like it would be a little bit like a science textbook that was rewritten so that every sentence said things like electrons are correctly perceived to be negatively charged, and owls are correctly perceived to be nocturnal, and so on and so forth. It just, what does it add? Sure, the intellectual perception does allow us to, have knowledge of the external world, but that doesn't mean it's essential to every single truth. Why the attributes get the intellectual perception treatment and no other definition does? I mean, it's the same with respect to, that's the thing that allows us to know about stuff.
La respuesta es que la percepción intelectual sería efectivamente una forma que permite conocimiento, sin embargo no es esencial a todas las otras formas de adquirir conocimiento.
I wouldn't agree with that. The ethics 5 is actually a proof negative of that, because you can actually, by intellectual perception, know the essence of singular things. So it's not exclusive for attributes. Also,
what I can say was, it just doesn't figure in any other definition.
But it is implied in the way Scienza Intuitiva works.
Is it?
Yes, it is.
That's very interesting. I'm glad to know that. I take on your authority.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Martin, for a very thought-provoking paper. I'm still trying to figure out what exactly you mean, because I was not here in the first 10 or 15 minutes. I'm very sorry about that. I had to arrive late. So I'm not fully sure especially from the answer you gave to Kiyosaki, I do understand you. But even if I understand you, I believe that the fact that we find conceptual and perceptual indications in the text is not a reason in itself for saying that the distinction between the attributes is conceptual. Because look at that, it seems to me that you're trying to find the easiest way out of a difficulty, which is real.
Always.
And you're thinking, okay, well, if we take it to be conceptual, we can make sense of this and that text. But it seems to me that there are so many other texts that you cannot make sense of. Whereas if you take it as ontological pluralism, then it's obvious that if two things are ontologically distinct, they will also be conceptually or perceptively distinct, whereas the reverse is not true. So the fact that we have those terms, perceive or conceive about things, like it's one same thing conceived under two attributes, does not entail that the distinction is only conceptual. That's my first point. And among the difficulties, among the difficulties which we have with the text, with the conceptual difference, is why is it the case that God is only the cause of another idea insofar as it is an idea and not the mode of any other attribute? That's one thing. Why is it the case that it's one and the same thing, but in the formal reality on the one hand and in the objective reality on the other? But, why is he saying all those things if it's only a perceptual distinction?
La pregunta, sí la entendí, es ¿por qué si se toma la interpretación conceptual del pluralismo de Spinoza, ¿por qué no se toman otras interpretaciones que se pueden hacer en otros textos que pudieran dar la idea de más bien un pluralismo ontológico? Sí, más de un pluralismo ontológico, could you elaborate?
A lo mejor puedo tratar de decirlo en inglés. El punto era que si hay una distinción ontológica, debe hacer también una distinción conceptual. Entonces, el hecho que hagamos términos como los de concebir o percepción no significa necesariamente que la distinción solo es conceptual, porque puede ser ontológica, pero como una consecuencia. Si algo es ontológicamente diferente, va a ser conceptualmente también. Y dos ejemplos de cosas difíciles de entender con una distinción solamente conceptual es el vocabulario de la causa, no causa, de la realidad formal versus objetiva de una cosa que como un hombre, un ser humano, es un cuerpo y una mente, y la mente es la realidad objetiva de una realidad formal que es el cuerpo, porque Spinoza utilizaría este vocabulario si fuera solamente una distinción conceptual. Y el otro ejemplo era por qué se dice que Dios solo puede ser la causa eficiente de una idea en cuanto es él mismo una idea y no un modo de otro atributo.
Well, you're absolutely right that if there's an ontological distinction that entails a conceptual distinction. So the fact that Spinoza repeatedly says that substances can be conceived under different attributes doesn't mean that they are merely conceptual. But it would be actually quite strange for him to prefer that way of putting things. It would be a bit like if I told you right before you.
No, what you're saying.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Sí, está diciendo que está de acuerdo con la idea de que una distinción ontológica también sería una distinción conceptual, pero
Okay. It'd be like if you're about to go skydiving, I told you that parachutes are conceived to be safe for skydiving. I'm sure you would say, wait a second, they're conceived? Are they safe? Oh, of course, yes, they're safe. They're also conceived as safe. It's like, why did you lead with conceived if they're actually safe? That sounds strongly like you're implying that they're conceived is the important part, maybe that they aren't. Now, I don't think that there's error here. I think that the old, illusionistic interpretation is false.
Usa el ejemplo de lanzarse en paracaídas. Decía, sí, se puede entender conceptualmente, se puede decir, es que lanzarse en paracaídas es conceptualmente seguro. Y diría uno, ¿cómo que conceptualmente seguro? Dice, no, sí, también es seguro. Entonces, diría, bueno, pero ¿por qué se hace la distinción de lo conceptual primero y no dejarse lo ontológico de lo seguro?
But there's something worth highlighting in that substances are conceived as thinking or conceived as extended. Now, moreover, I don't pull the distinction of reason out of nowhere. I mean, that's from Spinoza's own text. So he himself describes a distinction of the attributes as a distinction of reason. He himself describes the attributes in terms of how the substance is conceived. And now you say you're taking the easy way out. Yeah, I'm taking the easy way out. That's what he says. And I feel like if we can make sense of that in a straightforward way, it would be a bit mad not to take it. Now, I'll translate that and then I'll respond to the causation.
Sí, que sería la pregunta de si se toma la salida fácil. Sí, se toma la salida fácil, es la razón. Spinoza utiliza o menciona que es la razón la que hace las distinciones de los atributos y que, pues sí, efectivamente esa es la salida fácil, es una distinción que hace la razón, una distinción conceptual.
So with respect to the second question, which I think you take to be an example of the ontological significance of the attributes, I don't think so. I think that the schooling under Proposition 7, he's saying, I was talking about causal explanation. I only said that because of what we can perceive through the concepts that we're using. So in other words, I take him to be making a methodological point, not a metaphysical point. If you want to do good science, stick to one set of concepts at a time. You make scientific errors when you mix and match concepts belonging to different families. So if you're doing psychological explanation, stick with concepts associated with thought. If you want to do physics, stick with concepts associated with extension. Don't mix and match. It's bad scientific methodology. I mean, I think it's right there in the text. He says, I only said that because of what we can explain. And he says that right after he asserts identity, which would be a contradiction.
La idea sería más bien una cuestión metodológica que una cuestión metafísica. No se deberían mezclar los conceptos que se refieren a los atributos de extensión que a los atributos de pensamiento. Entonces se debería mantener cada cosa en su línea y eso queda expresado desde el momento en que Spinoza trata la identidad.
Formal objective reality? Well, what would you like to know about?
Are they not really distinct things?
No. So if you're describing the world in terms of the attribute of thought, you will be one of the ways that you describe the world is in terms of objective reality. That's part of the vocabulary, conceptual vocabulary associated with the attribute of thought. Is it things are contentful? Things have contents, representational contents. That's their objective reality. So that's just what it is to conceive of things under the attribute of thought. And also, of course, to conceive of things under the attribute of thought is to consider those vehicles as having formal reality.
La pregunta sería si no habría entonces distinción entre la realidad objetiva y la realidad formal. La respuesta es que no se considerarían distinciones porque ambas realidades se pueden concebir en la razón, entonces no habría una distinción de sustancias entre ambos casos.
Bueno, primero agradecer al doctor por su conferencia. Quiero, en orden de un poco replantear la pregunta del comentario del doctor Alfonso Villa, preguntar si la relación entre este monismo ontológico contrapuesto a un pluralismo que es eminentemente de carácter conceptual es una de las principales contribuciones de Spinoza, ya que, como se ha expuesto, recurre a toda la terminología escolástica, que se remite incluso hasta Aristóteles, pero que tiene una enorme diferencia, puesto que la metafísica aristotélica reduce, o más bien hay un pluralismo ontológico en la medida en que cada entidad es una sustancia. Y el monismo de carácter ontológico conduciría o permitiría una ética, digamos, de la infinitud, en la que los fines morales no estarían diseñados o dirigidos a satisfacer fines, por ejemplo, utilitarios o individuales. El mismo individuo humano desaparece, digamos, como finalidad en sí misma, puesto que en la medida en que solo es un modo de la sustancia, se encadena una, digamos, infinitud que hace desaparecer la ilusión de sentido que proyectamos en las morales de la finitud, llamemos. ¿Qué tanto su contribución está también en orden a apuntar a esta separación al sostener que el pluralismo es meramente de carácter conceptual? Sí, ¿qué tanto su contribución, su comunicación está dirigida a enfatizar el carácter meramente conceptual del pluralismo spinozista?
Thank you for your question. The first thing to say is that you're absolutely right. The important thing for me, or one important thing, is to emphasize metaphysically Spinoza is a monist. And that, there's all kinds of ways that monism gets compromised metaphysically at the hands of otherwise friendly interpreters. And I want to make sure to preserve what I take to be the most distinctive contribution of Spinoza is the monism is real and it's not compromised.
Agradece la pregunta y la idea o la idea principal de esta comunicación fue el enfatizar que Spinoza es un monista y que muchas veces se puede malinterpretar ese monismo, pero que fundamentalmente es eso, que Spinoza es sincero en su monismo.
And with respect to the Aristotelian tradition with which this language of substance and attribute comes, I think the monism is important because for Aristotle there are as many natures as there are kinds of things. And for Spinoza there's just one nature.
Y relativo a la cuestión aristotélica, para Aristóteles hay tantas naturalezas como sustancias, y para Spinoza hay solo una naturaleza, solo hay una sustancia.
So monism is the unity of nature.
El monismo sería la unidad de la naturaleza.
And I think there are important ethical consequences of this view of nature. I didn't undertake to explore them in this paper, but I very much agree that is the foundation for his moral vision.
Sí, que efectivamente hay consecuencias éticas de este tipo de concepción de la naturaleza. No se exploraron en esta comunicación, pero esta sería la base de esas concepciones éticas.
Thank you very much. Voy a hacerlo. Bueno, estoy totalmente de acuerdo con la lectura de los atributos y la relación con la sustancia. De hecho, Spinoza dice en esa misma carta 9 que el intelecto atribuye a la sustancia, o sea, habla de los atributos como una actividad del intelecto finito. Mi pregunta sería si entonces, si entendemos los atributos como perspectivas humanas, si esas perspectivas son en algún sentido limitadas, aún cuando nos dan acceso a la esencia total de la sustancia. O sea, mi pregunta sería si desde el punto de vista del intelecto absolutamente infinito, habría un único ser sin ninguna distinción conceptual, ni ontológica, por supuesto. ¿Y cómo piensa esta perspectiva sin perspectivas? O más perspectivas.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'm glad to agree. I think one thing that I wasn't able to explore in this paper, but I think relates in interesting ways to what Itzhak was talking about yesterday, is I think that Spinoza says in the correspondence with Chernhaus that we don't know the other attributes because we are bound by thought extension, other creatures aren't.
Agradece la pregunta y que se liga con la discusión que se tenía el día de ayer sobre Chernhaus y
we don't perceive the unknown attributes because we are composed of thought extension and other creatures aren't.
Nosotros como seres humanos no percibiríamos los demás atributos porque estamos limitados por los únicos dos que poseemos, el pensamiento y la extensión. Otras criaturas puede que no.
And I think that Spinoza, with the thinking of the provincial farmer and his missing cow, I think Spinoza's picture is something like that there are other creatures elsewhere in the universe that conceptualize things differently than we do.
Sí, que la pregunta o la concepción de Spinoza en ese sentido sería: había otras criaturas en el universo que pueden concebir la realidad de una forma distinta como lo hacemos nosotros.
For example, Martians might use concepts like thought and extension. So this is where the unknown attributes come from because they're not our concepts. They're not the concepts associated with our conceivings of the essence of God, but we may all be equally accurately grasping that essence, just with different concepts.
Por ejemplo, los marcianos pudieran tener los atributos del pensamiento y la extensión, ¿no? O sea, algo completamente distinto a lo nuestro, sin que eso signifique que no podamos, desde nuestro punto de vista, cada uno limitado, acceder a la esencia de la sustancia.
But I don't think there's no perspective-free view on reality.
Pero no habría una visión libre de perspectivas de la realidad.
The infinite intellect will comprise all of these ideas, even the ones alien to us, the Martian ideas, the all the unknown attributes will be represented in thought by different modes of thought.
Esta inteligencia infinita, abarcaría todos los distintos atributos y cada uno de ellos, estos distintos modos, estaría presente. ¿Habría más preguntas?
Are you saying that you take, I could find it, okay, just give me 1 second.
Probably.
You know the phrase, I think it's P5 in Ethics 2, in this column where it says, well, things would have more reality and there's more attributes, something like that.
Proposition 9 or 1?
Proposition part 1?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me check that. Anyway, are you taking this proposition to mean that there are other types of beings that have several attributes? Because I think an easy way to read that is simply to say, okay, there are those beings that have 2 attributes, and there's God who's got an infinity. Why should we postulate an in-between? How do you reconcile a possibility of having people or beings with, say, 5 attributes? I really don't know what to make of this idea.
Well, I don't know how many conceptual schemes that the Martians have. They have probably 2 or more. I don't think it's important. I think that, so I take Proposition 9 just to be saying every possible way there is of conceiving of God, God is conceived in that way. Just because he's infinite.
La pregunta era sobre la necesidad de postular seres intermedios entre el ser humano y Dios. Por ejemplo, el ejemplo de los marcianos que se utilizaba, si no era simplemente suficiente decir la persona tiene dos atributos, Dios tiene infinitos atributos. La respuesta del doctor Lin es que era un ejemplo, pero que si hay infinitos atributos divinos, entonces hay formas o hay modos infinitos también de concebirlos. Los marcianos tal vez pudieran tener 2 o 5, pero estaría dentro del reino de las posibilidades. Sí.
Yeah, I thought a little bit there.
Okay. Vamos a cerrar la sesión de preguntas en este momento. Doctor Alfonso, doctor Víctor, ¿algunas palabras que quieran decir? Entonces, Dr. Lee, we thank you very much for this conference. Thank you.